We'll finally, no, not finally, still finally for the speakers, listen to Miguel Toledano Lanza. He's the political attaché of the European Conservatives and Reformists in the European Parliament. So he will take us up north. Mr. Toledano Lanza is an economic advisor in various environments such as employment and social affairs. And he'll, of course, talk about the relation between European policies and the supply of natural resources, more specifically, the role of social economy organizations as promoted by the European Social Economy Action Plan. The floor is yours. And then afterwards, we'll have some Q&As before we take a coffee break.
Dank u wel. Ik zal proberen een beetje op Nederlands te praten. Dank u wel aan de Universiteit Antwerpen, aan UXIA, aan USOS voor deze uitnodiging. Thank you very much for this invitation today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have prepared a presentation, but I will try to link with what has been said before on various items, since I think that might be more useful for all of us to draw conclusions and for the students also to follow the working progress of the due diligence directive. I have been asked to speak on two items. The first item being the corporate sustainability due diligence. And well, it has been said that this is a directive, and it has been proposed by the European Commission, and it's been now discussed both at the European Parliament and at the Council, which you know are the co-legislators for European law. Now, this might be one of the most relevant pieces of legislation that are being discussed in the current legislature of the Parliament, because you can see that there are a lot of committees involved. Of course, one has the lead, in this case, the Legal Committee in the Parliament, but you can see that all of these committees, including the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, are being involved in the discussion. This morning, there was a negotiation meeting in the Employment and Social Affairs between the different political groups in Strasbourg. Now, the definition of sustainability, and here I would like to make a link with Professor Heenan's point about social justice, is this going beyond purely environmental items to include also the compliance with human rights and possibly also governance, including social matters. Now, to what extent, because that is the focus of the directive, to what extent does that assure social justice, being social justice defined as this fair distribution of benefits and costs? This is something that could be, of course, discussed. Now, this is probably the most relevant slide of the five I am going to show you, because I have tried to put here some of the challenges that we are encountering when drafting the directive. First of all, there are some challenges regarding the scope of the directive. Who does the directive impact? Who are the companies, particularly, that are obliged to comply with the standards set by the directive? And should we just include multinationals, or should we also incorporate SMEs, small and medium enterprises, with the risks that also Professor Verbrugge was mentioning? In a way, in a certain way, all companies, I would say all companies, small and medium enterprises, are indirectly included in the scope, because even if the directive only applies to a certain size, the the fact that the companies need to survey their value chain impacts indirectly other companies which have a smaller size. So from this point of view, of course, not all obligations are impacting all companies the same way, but in a way, small and medium enterprises are indeed impacted indirectly. There is a big discussion also whether to focus on the value chain or the supply chain. The supply chain being an upstream perspective, and the value chain obliging the company to survey everything that is also being done downstream, what the customers of a particular company are also doing along the whole value chain. Then, of course, this directive does not only apply to mining. Mining is just one sector. One could discuss, is this holistic approach the right way? Because, of course, by widening the horizontal scope of the directive, you might lose the particularities of different sectors that have been exposed today. So to what extent is a directive, a horizontal directive, the best approach? Might it not be more efficient to have other kinds of regulation in place, international agreements, sectoral codes, standards, an EU label, social dialogue. The Commission has proposed the directive, which naturally will need to be implemented by the member states, but it's horizontal. It will need to be applied the same way to all sectors, mining and other sectors that have other difficulties. And then also, one of the speakers before was referring to the different, not just sectors and activities as is here in the slide, but also different regions. There are some of the politicians that say there should be, because there are regions where these issues are being treated in a more delicate way, they should also be focused more precisely. It does not seem to be the case now, but negotiations are going on, so it's difficult to anticipate what will come out. Then, of course, we have the impact on companies, and Professor Verbrugge was mentioning this. We need to reach a proportionate directive. We need to reach a directive where all stakeholders feel ownership of. There is a certain tendency, and of course in some sectors and activities this can of course be the case, but there is a certain tendency to blame on companies what is happening, and a lot of EU companies are actually leaders of good management in the world. So there needs to be, and this is also a risk with the directive, something that is applying to everyone, does not really put the focus always on what really needs to be tackled in the first place. There are risks, and there was also the example from Congo, and also Professor Verbrugge mentioned it before, and I put it here in the slide, that there is a risk that the consequence of the directive is not what was intended. And in the end, there are examples, and we heard one from Congo, of delocalization. I mentioned here an act that has been recently passed in the United States called the Inflation Reduction Act. And this has been a measure precisely to protect US companies against delocalization. So we have an economic situation now where a directive burdening European companies further could produce precisely a further delocalization towards the United States or towards China of economic activity. And of course, this is not what we want. We want to comply with human rights, but in a proportionate way. And then finally, of course, we have some challenges dealing with our legal tradition. And in a way, this directive, I would not say that poses risks to our legal tradition, but indeed introduces some ways of thinking that are to a certain extent new. Our legal tradition supports the responsibility of our own acts. And in this case, we are introducing responsibility for acts of third parties, which not always are easy to control. Imagine that a company needs to comply with standards along the whole supply chain. So it might be difficult for a company to control what is being done upstream if the company does not have a direct relationship. Then, of course, we have the responsibility not for infractions, but also for potential risks. And during the negotiation of the precise text in the Parliament now, there is a lot, and we will see what comes out, but there is a lot of potentiality. A lot of potential risks versus infractions. And of course, this poses challenges of legal security and the risk also of blocking management decisions. And this, in a way, has also been mentioned before. Finally, I included this idea, this term police, because also it is not the public administrations anymore that need to survey what is happening in terms of complying with the law or not complying with the law, but it is the stakeholders in the supply chain that need to be surveying one another. And I am not saying that this should not be done, but this is also a change of paradigm. Okay, and the two last slides focus on a different matter. So the due diligence is what companies will not be able to do in the future once the directive is being transposed. But at the same time, the European Union is launching a plan. So in this case, this is not a legal instrument, but a plan launched by the Commission to support financially companies that have a social goal, I would call it a positive approach versus the due diligence directive. And in this case, you have here the 4 pillars that these so-called social economy institutions need to comply with. So they need to, first of all, have as goals those that have been identified by the European Union as being a priority in the current moment: digital transition, green transition, then a reinvestment of most of their profit, a democratic governance, and having a social or a collective goal instead of just the goal of the undertaking itself. And this is hard for you to read, but before the 20th of February, there is still time to present projects, so-called pledges, around 14 areas that the European Commission has identified that should be promoted and protected because of these social goals. And with this, I end my presentation here, and I remain open to your questions.